Recording in progress.
Hello, and welcome back to our study of the book of Nehemiah. This term, we are going through the book of Nehemiah with the title Kingdom Assignment, a subtitle being The Relentless Pursuit of Obedience. What we've been looking at through these few lessons so far is how Nehemiah, called of God to go back and have a heart for Jerusalem, looked to rebuild the walls and the gates around Jerusalem. The temple had already been built and rebuilt the decades before when the first waves of exiles go back. Nehemiah realizes there's more work to be done. He's saddened. His king in Persia sees that he's saddened, asks what he needs. And with the commissioning and approval and funding and protection of the Persian government, Nehemiah is allowed to go back. And what he does is he organizes the rebuilding of the walls and gates project. What we looked at in the last lesson is a very detailed description of who was assigned or who took up the repair of what part of the wall and gates. There was a hint of opposition, one from those that were related to one of the officials, the Tekoites. They didn't have everybody on board. What we're going to see today, and it was already hinted at back in chapter 2, is that there were others who were opposed. We'll take a little bit more look at them in this lesson. If you have your Bibles, open them up to chapter 4 of the book of Nehemiah. We're going to focus on the first 8 verses, but that's going to set the tone because I do want to go ahead and grab up and capture all that's in verses 9 to 23 of this chapter as well. Not so much as to go into a deep detail of teaching it, but rather to go through those various verses, showing how, as we'll see in the outline in a moment, so showing how Nehemiah goes about doing what he needs to do as he faces the opposition. In getting started, there are a couple things I'd like to bring up as we move forward, though. We know the work's begun and there's already been opposition, but what we're going to see here is really an unexplained opposition. It appears mainly that it's ethnic. It could be that it's coming under the guise of trying to accuse Nehemiah and those rebuilding the walls and gates as to maybe precipitating some kind of revolt against the Persian government. At least that's the kind of argument that's going to be made and has been made. What we're going to see, however, is they're going to persist in their opposition to Nehemiah and those rebuilding the temple. And what we're seeing in this lesson then is what Nehemiah does to not only seek the Lord in this, but what other practical actions and steps he can take to make sure that the building project goes forward. In the previous lesson, of course, we saw the detail of who worked on what part of the wall and what gates. We just hadn't seen the process in progress yet. And now we are, and that's when the opposition comes. One of the things I want you to think about as we go forward are a couple of names. One is Sanballat, and the other is Tobiah or Tobias. There's a third one who's been mentioned in chapter 2, verse 16. His name is Geshem the Arab. He's not going to come up by name here in this lesson, although his people are. And then he will come up again in the succeeding lessons. There will be in chapter 6 a couple more times when he's brought up. As I mentioned in the first lesson, the two that I'm often familiar with in regard to the opposition to the Jews at this point are Sanballat and Tobias. It's almost as if I can be silly. Um, Geshem is like the third Ghostbuster, so to speak. If you remember the old Ghostbusters movie, there were the three main characters, but when they were doing the battle against the big mighty monster ghost, there was a fourth one, and he didn't have much to do with the rest of the movie. It's kind of like what's going on with this text. Geshem, the Arab, plays a part here and there, but he's not factored in most of the time. But he's there. And what I think Nehemiah is doing is wherever you might expect the others who are named to be involved, he's not far behind. Geshem is right there, and his people are there as well. I want to bring in a couple of thoughts as we get started as well. We've already said that the book of Nehemiah is not a leadership manual, but we do see how God used Nehemiah in his leadership. And as a result, we can draw certain leadership principles, organizational principles. Ultimately, we need to know how and see how God is fulfilling his promises in a very specific way. We identified that last lesson. But we're also seeing how partnering with God uh, is valuable, and really it needs the work of God and the help of God for it all to be successful. But there are a couple of things I want to bring up at this point to kind of bring it into full view for us. The unit title is Kingdom Assignment. And while we often want to keep as parallel as possible the text and its historical context with our own, that would mean, in other words, that would mean Nehemiah is working for the kingdom and he's working for the people of God. We know that ultimately there would be the sense in which we are leading for the people of God. But Randall Everett in the student guide, as he's written the lessons for the student guide of the unit that we're looking at, indicates there are different levels that each of us participates in doing kingdom work. And so I want to point that out because I know a lot of times we bring up application at the end, but I want us to consider who we are, where we are, what roles we play, and definitely glean any kinds of principles that we can from this text regarding how we serve the Lord in our various capacities. And as a side note, if I may be so um, open about it, I know that last week the word of the week seemed to be glean, and I've already started using that word. We'll see what the word of the week is this time. Well, here are some things that Randall Everett says about being in leadership. I'll quote him, and then he quotes another individual. He quotes Charles Swindoll. We may know him more as Chuck Swindoll um, at Stonebriar Church. He's a longtime pastor, former chancellor at Dallas Theological Seminary, prolific author and preacher. He has a few things to say about leadership and what to expect in leadership. And I just felt like what Randall did in his own comments and in sharing what Chuck Swindoll has said in this regard are very valuable. So let me first quote Randall Everett, former executive director of the Baptist General Convention of Texas and now an advocate for religious freedom and so forth, says these things. He says, Nehemiah was doing kingdom work, but there are other forms of kingdom work as well. Anyone, he says this directly, anyone who wishes to make a kingdom impact, whether it is as a godly parent at home, sharing Christ verbally at work, taking a Christian stand in the community, or blazing new trails as a missionary, he or she will face opposition. Leaders become acquainted with criticism and discouragement. And you can add to that list any kind of leadership position you're going to be in. And especially as you are seeking to serve the Lord, there will be opposition. There may be opposition from within, from other believers, interestingly enough. Certainly, there will be opposition from the outside. I'm thinking just real quickly about something that does parallel what we're talking about here. Say you as a church are working to remodel the church. Maybe it is expanding the parking lot or expanding a building. You might run into opposition from church members. You may also run into opposition from city codes and all kinds of seeking out the various permits and so forth. There may be people in the community that are opposed to you. You never know. The fact of the matter is, whenever you seek to serve the Lord, there's going to be opposition from someone. There are other kinds of parallels we can find here. The point is, both Jesus, Paul, and ultimately anyone who would seek to serve the Lord in a capacity to further his kingdom is going to find opposition. Just go back and look at Moses, go back and look at King David, go on and on and on. And there's opposition. What we're going to see in today's lesson is a certain kind of opposition that involves name calling, ridicule, mockery, and so forth. What Randall Everett's saying is all these different levels of kingdom work will find opposition and criticism. He says that on page 56 of the student guide that is often used with this lesson. Number two, he quotes from Chuck Swindoll, and I think it's helpful and insightful. Swindoll says this: anyone who steps in the arena of leadership must be prepared to pay a price. True leadership exacts a heavy toll on the whole person, and the more effective the leadership, the higher the price. I could add my own side note, the larger the circle of influence, the greater the price. The leader must soon face the fact that he will be the target of critical darts. Unpleasant though it may sound, you haven't really led until you have become familiar with the stinging barbs of the critics. He concludes with these words, good leaders must have thick skin. Uh, Everett's quoting him, but the original quote comes from Swindoll's book, Hand Me Another Brick. Well, as we get started, let me prepare you for the outline. I want to show that to you. We're going to be looking focally, if I can use that word, for verses 1 through 8, but we will spend some time in verses 9 to 23, just kind of walking through it together to show how ultimately Nehemiah carried out the plan in dealing with the opposition. So let me pull this up for you to see. And what we're going to see as we go through overcoming the enemy, we'll see these things. First, the first three verses summarize for us the ridicule and mocking that Nehemiah and the builders take by the opponents. Then what we're going to see in verses 4 to 5, Nehemiah's imprecatory prayer. When you read that, you may also keep in mind what Jesus had to say and wonder if there's any validity in our mimicking what Nehemiah does with this prayer. Number 3, or part C, the people's commitment to work. A very short statement, but nonetheless important, because regardless of the opposition, verse 6 tells us the people had a mind to work. Then the conclusion of our main focus, verses 7 and 8, the redoubling opposition through conspiracy. What we're going to see there are those named characters opposing Nehemiah and the builders by offering up conspiracies against them. And then we can't finish without looking at verses 9 to 23 in some form or fashion, the plan of Nehemiah to deal with the opposition and its final outcome. So as we get ready to look at this, let's go ahead and let me read the text to you. And as I read it, you'll follow along in your own text. It may be that you'll find a couple of translation differences here. Nothing that's in this lesson or this passage is going to be controversial. Everything's pretty straightforward, but it will set the stage. We'll look at the text as a whole, and then what we'll do is we will then break it down according to the outline passages or outline segments that we've identified. Let me read to you here. As you've known for a while, I read in this study, or from the New American Standard Bible, the 2020 edition. Here's Nehemiah in somewhat of his own memoirs or his own diary about what was going on. He says this: "Now it came about that when Sanballat heard that we were building or rebuilding the wall, he became furious and very angry, and he mocked the Jews. And he spoke in the presence of his brothers and the wealthy people of Samaria, and said, 'What are these feeble Jews doing? Are they going to restore the temple for themselves? Can they offer sacrifices? Can they finish it in a day? Can they revive the stones from the heaps of rubble, even the burned ones?' Now Tobiah the Ammonite was near him, and he said, 'Even what they are building, if a fox were to jump on it, it would break their stone wall down.' Then Nehemiah said this: 'Hear, O our God, how we are an object of contempt. Return their taunting on their own heads, and turn them into plunder in a land of captivity. Do not forgive their guilt, and do not let their sin be wiped out before you, for they have demoralized the builders.'" Strong words. He goes on to say this. After the prayer, he returns to his narrative. "So we built the wall, and the entire wall was joined together to half its height, for the people had a mind to work. When Sanballat, Tobiah, and the Arabs, the Ammonites, and the Ashdodites heard that the repair of the walls of Jerusalem went on, and that the breaches began to be closed, they were very, very angry. So all of them conspired together to come to fight against Jerusalem and to cause confusion in it." Excuse my butchered reading there. What's going on here? Well, Nehemiah is giving us his update on what's been taking place. He outlines, of course, the opposition, names them, describes what he does in terms of preparing for this. He prays. We'll talk about that prayer in a moment. And then, of course, they get to work. What you're going to see then in verses 9 to 23 is what they had to do to prepare for what is mentioned in verse 8 about conspiring to oppose the people building the walls. Well, first, we know about Sanballat. He's already been mentioned before. The Horonite, he's probably from at least has descent. He's a descendant of those from Horonaim, which would have been somewhere on the east side, I believe. I'm having to double check my notes real quick. Let me look at that again. I know that I have some information here. I will look at it when we get to the final part. I'll correct myself if I need to. What we're seeing here, though, eventually there's a scheme and a pattern to the opposition that I want to highlight for you. Notice the language that's used here. He became furious and very angry. Now, he had already, along with Tobiah and Geshem, previously offered up opposition and resistance and tried to stop Nehemiah. It wasn't a major attack, so to speak, but certainly there was resistance and questioning and challenging Nehemiah back in chapter 2, where they had basically accused him of seeking to rebuild the wall and the gates so as to be preparation for a revolt against Persia, as we've mentioned. Well, that didn't stop Nehemiah. In fact, as we read in the previous lesson, Nehemiah had organized all the workers and they had already prepared to look at what section they were going to rebuild. As they're working, Sanballat becomes furious and very angry, the New American Standard Bible says. You see what your translations say. He's hot. He's mad. He's already made comments to try and stop them, and they're still going forward. We know that Nehemiah has prayed. He'll pray again here. But then it says they mocked the Jews. He mocked the Jews. Uh, what's going on here, of course, is I think largely ethnic. There could be other things here we'll talk about in a moment, but certainly there is this opposition to them. We do know that what the Persians did is let people go back to their homeland whenever they conquered a people who had previously been scattered. We know that the Assyrians and the Babylonians made a practice of scattering the people. And so what you're finding here in this land is a lot of people from different places. And now the Jews are coming back to their own place. And part of that resistance then comes from those who had been there a while, even though they're not originally from there. And it is during this time period we also find the Samaritans. We'll see a reference to Samaria here in this lesson as well. But they're mad. Sanballat is not happy about this. And so what he does is he talks to, as verse 2 says, his brothers and the wealthy people of Samaria. Now, it's not likely necessarily that Sanballat is a Sumerian himself, but he certainly has made some kind of pact with them, some kind of agreement with them. There's an association there. And usually, if there's a common enemy, then you could be friends with people that wouldn't necessarily be your friends. But here we're seeing a conspiracy take place and it's building. What they do is they come together, and what you're finding is a series of questions that, when you slow down and think about it, these are mocking, ridiculing, sarcastic types of questions. Listen to the questions again. This is the taunting. It's the Old Testament version of nah, 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 nah. Okay, they're people that are taunting, and they're trying to break them down and break their resolve and break their motive, break their the other word I'm looking for has to do with their spirit, so to speak, break their resolve, try to get them to figure that we don't want to do this. If we're going to have to put up with this kind of opposition, is it really worth it? Well, notice the questions. These questions obviously kind of have their own built-in answer, all of them driven to break the people down. What we find is, of course, it doesn't work. Notice the questions again. What are these feeble Jews doing? It's almost like they're standing along the walls as people are working, calling to the public, bringing to attention the fact that these people are working, but they're useless, or they're, as the word feeble is used, making fun of them. What are they doing? Look at this silliness. The question then, can they offer sacrifices? Now, the New American Standard talks about the temple being built. That's in italics. Clearly, by then, the temple is already built. But it may be that the context allows for this to be referenced to the walls and the temple complex. Of course, the temple had to be built for there to be sacrifices. The question, of course, is can they go back to offering sacrifices? In other words, are they going to really focus on their religion? Are they actually going to be able to stand up and build their own faith back and their own land and their own people? Then they said, can they finish in a day? Now, of course, we're going to find out how long it takes. You already know I'm not going to steal your thunder from the thunder of the text, but clearly it's exaggeration, and it's certainly a lot of ridicule to say in question, can they finish it in a day? Of course they can't, but they're working hard. One of the things that these opponents see is there are people working all around the wall. They're not starting in one area of the wall and then working their way around. They're working on all parts of the wall at the same time. So obviously there's production going on. Maybe they're seeing how quickly things are going, but they're still going to taunt them about how fast or how slow it's going to take them to do it. And then the final question, can they revive the stones from the heaps of rubble, even the burned ones? Clearly, what they're also referencing is the fact that there was a lot of work that needed to be done by collecting the stones, maybe reusing old stones, finding other stones, cleaning things out. There's a lot there. So there's a lot of prep work to be done. And along the way, you can just see Sanballat and the others really ridiculing them. And we can come up with a number of other synonyms to identify what they're doing. But notice it's not just Sanballat anymore. There are wealthy people from Samaria. There are, quote, his brothers, maybe some of his own people group that are there. Well, verse 3 then tells us about Tobiah the Ammonite. He chimes in. He happens to be near Sanballat. He's been the quiet one so far, but he's there, and he's going to mock the strength of the wall. He's going to mock how well is the wall going to be built. Notice his way of saying it. Even what they are building, if a fox were to jump on it, it would break their stone wall down. He's saying they're doing a really poor job. However fast they're doing it, it's not going to last. We kind of know in our own day, usually, how fast a building can be built. Maybe we have reason to question its solid nature, but a good solid building, strong, will take a while. Here he sees how fast they're working, and his ridicule is, oh, a little old fox could jump on it and knock it down. But he's really, really heaping up, no pun intended, heaping up all the ridicule against them. So you have Sanballat and his group, you have Tobias or Tobiah, again called the Ammonite. Well, that'll be important in a moment as we get to the visual, if you will, of what this opposition looks like. But what we're seeing here are these different groups coming against Nehemiah and the Jews as they're rebuilding the wall. It's important to realize that this opposition has already been in place. We've dealt with it back in chapter 2. There was a hint of it there, and it's back. Now it's in full force. Knowing that the opposition is there and the taunting is going on, Nehemiah responds in his own way. We know of Nehemiah's practice to pray. He prayed when he found out the walls were in ruins and the gates were torn down. He prayed again when he was dealing with what to say to the king about the situation. And now he's praying in light of the ridicule and the mocking. His prayer is rather interesting, and it does call into question for us as believers today. Is there a place for us to pray something like this? Well, let's deal with it as the text says, and then we can wrestle with the issue of what's called an imprecatory prayer. Notice what Nehemiah prays. He's related to us what's taken place, and now he's praying about it. Hear, O our God, how we are an object of contempt. So he's identifying the situation. We're in a bad way here. We're being ridiculed. We are the objects of people's anger and wrath and ridicule. And of course, the NASB says the word contempt. Here's what he prays: return their taunting on their own heads, turn them into plunder and a land of captivity. He's basically saying they're ridiculing us, they're taunting us, they're calling us all kinds of names. Put it back on them. Make them feel bad. Make them become nothing more than plunder. They're already in a land of captivity. The Persians have been taking over from the Babylonians. These people are still in the area. They've been there blended with the people from the time of the Babylonians. And Nehemiah is just saying, Lord, don't bring any good to them. Whatever evil they're wishing upon us, we wish upon them. And then he says something even stronger in verse 5. Do not forgive their guilt, and do not let their sin be wiped out before you. Language that you find in the Psalms on the opposite extreme, or in the opposite direction, where there is prayer for forgiveness for oneself, and that the sin will be wiped away, and that there are promises that the sin would be wiped away. This is totally opposite of what Jesus did. This is totally opposite of what Stephen did when he was being stoned in the book of Acts. He's in the middle of being stoned to death, and he says, Lord, do not hold this against them. Jesus prayed on the cross, forgive them, for they do not know what they're doing. Here, Nehemiah prays the total opposite. Don't forgive them. Bring back their own taunting. Don't let their sin be wiped out. Why? He gives the answer at the end of verse 5. For they have demoralized the builders. They have come against your people. They are ridiculing your people. The builders are the people of God. They are the Jewish people that have been allowed back into their homeland to rebuild the temple, to take over the land, and to rebuild the walls. We may not look at this prayer in a positive way in one respect, but there's a certain note about imprecatory psalms and imprecatory prayers, and that is this. Normally, they called for the end, if you will, the destruction of an enemy when it was seen that that enemy really opposed God. It wasn't about a personal vendetta. It was about the fact that, Lord, you know these people are coming against your people, but in coming against your people, they're coming against you. and therefore deal with them justly. That might be what's going on here. Nehemiah may be in some way, quote, inspired by those imprecatory Psalms, where in the past, thinking of opposition against oneself as opposition against God, and as a result, calling on God to deal justly with the people, deal with them in the way that they have dealt with the Jews. There might be something like that. Clearly, he says they have demoralized the builders, those that have been working on the gate. They are your people. The prayer laments first the fact that they are being mistreated, and then the request is to have basically vengeance, basically to bring back on them what they have brought to the people. But those are strong words. Don't forgive. Don't let the sin be wiped out before you. It could be that this is a focus on what Nehemiah understood from the Psalms about imprecatory prayers, again, going after the people because they're going after God. How do we do this, though, when we feel that we are being opposed and when we are literally opposed? Should we pray that our enemy, or who we might perceive as the enemy of God, be dealt with in such a way as that God would not be forgiving, that they would get what their evil actions deserved? It's a hard question to ask. It's harder to answer. We do look at things in light of Jesus, who said, love our enemies, who also said to pray for them. And what Jesus did himself was pray for them. We see Stephen doing that. There are other places in the letters of Paul that talk about not returning evil for evil. Go back and look at Romans 12, for instance. How do we reconcile all of this? Maybe there is a way in which we can say, Lord, we just hand this over to you. We are dealing with this problem. They are opposing us. We are trying to do your work. We hand this over to you to deal with. Probably let God do it the way he would want to do it and not tell him how to do it. Certainly you can feel the emotion that Nehemiah has. Everything's been pointing in the direction of him being able to build this wall. He's gotten affirmation from God first, then approval from the king of Persia next, as well as all the backing, all the finances, and then as well the supplies that they were receiving along the way. And there are these people that are opposing them and accusing them of trying to raise up the wall so as to then be a citadel or a fortress to withstand any kind of opposition from Persia, or in some way to incite a revolt against Persia, and then they would be able to hide in the city. They're being falsely accused. And I'll tell you right now, I'm one who doesn't take well being falsely accused. Many people will tell you I don't, as David Banner used to say on the Hulk, don't make me angry. You won't like me when I'm angry. I won't say it that way and to say that I'll become like the Hulk or become furious, but I'll say it this way. Please don't accuse me of something I've never done. I don't take well to being accused of something I've not done. Nehemiah is dealing with being accused of things he's not doing. And he's also knowing that he has the rights to do what he's doing. And so these people that are opposing him are more than just a thorn in the flesh, so to speak. They represent opposition to what God has commanded. So what do we do? Well, on my own level, I need to be careful the way I react to opposition. There's a proper reaction. If anything, we can say that Nehemiah does the right thing, at least in turning it over to God. Do we affirm that he should then ask God to destroy these people? That's another discussion. But I think at least we can be hesitant at that point and say, maybe he shouldn't have gone that far. Recording that he has said that doesn't necessarily mean that we should affirm it. It's just what Nehemiah did. But I think there's room for the debate and there's room for the discussion, especially in light of our being New Testament Christians. I will start with this, though. It is important to take the concerns that we have, the opposition that we face, and hand it over to the Lord and say, Lord, you need to handle this. It's hard for us to do it. Ultimately, the rationale, of course, for his prayer is to protect his people. He said they have demoralized the builders. That's what the taunting has done. That's what the mocking has done. That's what the sarcasm has done. That beats them down, so to speak. And as they're trying to work, they keep hearing this. And of course, it does bring them down. Nehemiah is coming to the defense of his people, and he's calling out to the Lord for that. Certainly, there's something to be said about that, coming to the defense of your people who are God's people. Well, what happens? We've got the opposition, we have Nehemiah's prayer, and then a very quick statement in verse 8. So we built the wall, and the entire wall was joined together to half its height, for the people had a mind to work. What's interesting about that is Nehemiah can pray that they were basically being beaten down, they were being demoralized, but they also had the mind to work, the resolve, the motive. They had all of it within them to work. And the result was, in a very short time, the wall is about half the height that it will ultimately be. It's generally understood to be height. The New American Standard does put the word height in italics, indicating contextually that's what the reference is. It says half. Does that mean halfway around, halfway up? What does it mean? Most are going to take it as halfway up. The point, though, is despite all the opposition, they keep building, they keep working. The entire wall was being joined together. So they had the right basis, they had the right notion, they had the right motive. Their mind was set, their focus was narrow on what they had to do. Despite all the opposition, despite all the things that their ears were being filled with, they kept working and they were diligent. Nehemiah prays and they act. The fact that they keep working, however, despite the opposition, raises the ire even more of the opponents. And that's why we see in verses 7 and 8 what I call the redoubling of the opposition through conspiracy. Conspiracy here meaning let's gather up some more people to join in this opposition. Let's read verses 7 and 8 again. It says, Now when Sanballat, Tobiah, the Arabs, the Ammonites, and the Ashdodites heard that the repair of the walls the walls of Jerusalem went on, and that the breaches began to be closed, they were very angry. So all of them conspired together to fight against Jerusalem and to cause confusion in it. Well, we already know Sanballat the Horonite. Tobiah himself is an Ammonite. Geshem is an Arab. So while Geshem is not referenced here, his people are. And then you have the Ashdodites. What's going on here? Well, Sanballat is associated at least with the Sumerians or the Samaritans at this point. That's in the north. So you have the Ammonites in the east, the Arabs from the west, or the south, excuse me, and the Ashdodites from the southwest west. Basically, what's happening is this opposition, conspiracy, this collaboration, if you will, this conspiracy, which is what it really is, represents surrounding the people of Jerusalem and the walls. It's not enough that they had people calling out names. There was a gathering in of people from all over, from these different people groups, from these different directions. Basically, then, they were literally surrounded. And while they are surrounded, they still have to deal with the ridicule and the fighting and the threats. All of them conspired together to come to fight against Jerusalem and to cause confusion in it. Sometimes you think if you focus on addressing an enemy or an opponent that it would stop. Sometimes, as we see here, it just increases the opposition. And that speaks to the evil of the person involved. Sanballat, Tobiah, Geshem, though not named here, certainly he's in the background, and all these other people groups have come up against the Jews. It didn't matter that they are seeing before their eyes the walls are being built regardless. They are doing whatever they can to try and stop it. And they're going to fight. This is a military type endeavor that they are about to embark on. Because of that, of course, we have Nehemiah pray, but we also have Nehemiah plan. And what we're seeing in verses 9 to 23 then is the implementation of a plan so that they can both build the wall and protect themselves against the opposition. Notice how strong this opposition is. All of them from different directions, led by specific leaders, are coming against the Jews. They hear that the walls are being prepared despite the fact that they are trying to mock them. Their efforts to mock them, their efforts to beat them down verbally aren't working. In fact, the people have a mind to work harder. That just makes them step up their game, so to speak, in their opposition. They're seeing that the walls are being built, the breaches are being closed, the gates are being put back up. That means that there's a place for Jerusalem, or the place in Jerusalem for the Jews to be protected, and these people don't like it. Their response is one of anger. As we said, this represents a geographical opposition. Now, I mentioned that Sanballat was a Horonite. Many would suggest that it's from Horonaim, and that would be, and that's referenced earlier in the Bible, that would be Moab. So Moab would have been right there south of the area of Ammon. So you'd have the Edomites on the southeast side of the Dead Sea. Moab north of that, and then the Ammonites north of that. What we're seeing then with his at least alliance with the people of Samaria represents a full circle, if you will, of opposition against the Jews. So for a moment, think of that. I don't want to put the map back up just to give it to, just imagine Jerusalem, the people working, and there are soldiers, military people, there's all kinds of opposition from 4 and 5 different people groups, all seeking to stop and thinking about doing whatever is necessary to stop the rebuilding of the wall. You have this greater threat now from all kinds of different people. As I said, I don't know the full nature of all of the opposition. It seems mainly ethnic. Certainly could be religious. I mean, this could be, as Nehemiah says, in opposition to God himself. Were they maybe threatened by their positions? These were also people who are officials within their people groups. And here comes Nehemiah along, following after Zerubbabel and Ezra. Here's leadership. There's strong leadership in Jerusalem now. Do they find Nehemiah as a threat? Well, certainly they see him more as a threat the stronger he stands and the more vehement he is and the more motivated he is to get the work done and effective as he is to have the people working. These people don't like it. There can be any number of reasons. But let me just say this. Sometimes it may help to know what the problem is, why the people are opposing. But usually it's just a matter of dealing with it because the focus needs to be on the work of the Lord. Nehemiah is focusing on the work of the Lord. He's working to get the work of the building of the wall done. Maybe in our own lives, we can't find the appropriate rationale for why someone opposes us. Some people are just mean. Some people just don't like others to be doing well. There can be any number of reasons. In the end, we still turn it over to the Lord, and we still do the wise thing that Nehemiah is going to do, and we do what we can to protect ourselves. And that's going to be the most important thing in that scheme. Doing the work of the Lord, looking straight ahead to do the work of the Lord. We can't judge the motives of why people oppose us. Already, whatever explanation, rationale, prayer that Nehemiah can give, it's not doing anything to convince these opponents that they need to stop. So what Nehemiah does is he organizes. And so what I would like to do is go through verses 9 to 23. I'll make a quick statement about what's coming up, read it, and if there's any other comment necessary, we will. But I want you to see that there is a plan here that ends up allowing them to work, but also protect themselves. When they prayed, they still prepared and they planned and they put people up on posts, so to speak, if I can keep the alliteration going, about protecting themselves from the danger. So what I've titled this is the plan and the outcome, verses 9 to 23. First, we have the response of Nehemiah and the people when the efforts to oppose were stepped up by all these people groups. First was the response in prayer. Verse 9, it says, "But we prayed to our God, and because of them, we set up a guard against them day and night." So, 2 things they did. First, they prayed, and then they set up a guard. They set up a series or a cycle of protection day and night. That gets more specific as we read the text. Certainly praying that God protect, but then they did what they needed to protect. We still need to recognize that we need to plan whenever we are faced with opposition. We need a plan to move forward. What happens then is that as they do put together a plan, still doubts arise. Notice this saying in verse 10 that follows. It says, "So in Judah it was said, the strength of the burden bearers is failing, yet there is much rubble, and we ourselves are unable to rebuild the wall." There's resolve to build. There's doubts about being able to build because of the opposition. There's that tension between motive and opposition. And now they have to figure out, I've got to work on the wall, but I've got to worry about this people that may want to try and attack me. Well, what we see then in verse 11 are the enemies resolved to kill them and to stop the work. Notice what it says. Nehemiah says, "And our enemies said, they will not know or see until we come among them, kill them, and put a stop to the work." So now the threats are being stepped up and followed by verbal types of things. Now, whether they said that directly to the people, they certainly were saying it among themselves. That word gets out. But they're saying they won't know it until it happens. They're coming after them to kill them. This is how serious they are taking the rebuilding of this wall. Well, In the next thing, in verse 12, we find this. They spread the news to warn about the threats. So word gets out about the threats, and then they start spreading the news among each other about the threats. Verse 12 says this, when the Jews who lived near them came and told us 10 times, quote, they will come up against us from every place where you may turn. So there's a warning 10 times over to be prepared and be aware that they're coming from everywhere. No matter where you look, there's going to be opposition. But in verse 13, we start to see a plan come together. We have already had the general statement about protection day and night, that they prayed, but then they also set up guards. But here's what else happened, more specifically in fulfilling that general statement of a plan. Nehemiah sets up watchmen and guards to protect. Verse 13 reads like this. Then I stationed men in the lowest parts of the space behind the wall, the exposed places, and I stationed the people in families with their swords, spears, and bows. This is not being passive. This is not saying we're not going to do anything. This is in case we have to fight, we have the people in place. We have to work, but now we've got to protect the workers. They look at various places that were particularly exposed, weak spaces, and so forth. Families, he said, and then they had their swords, their spears, and their bows. Well, then following that plan, there's further assurance. In verse 14 and following, you see Nehemiah offering assurance of God's greatness, and he calls them to fight if needed. Here's what he says. When I saw their fear, the people's fear, and again, the word fear is in italics because it's implied. When I saw their fear, I stood and said to the nobles, the officials, and the rest of the people, do not be afraid of them. Remember the Lord who is great and awesome. Fight for your brothers, your sons, your daughters, your wives, and your houses. So he sees the fear, but he says, don't be afraid. If you hear this, plus what you're going to hear in a moment, you hear echoes of what God told Moses, what God told Joshua, what God had told the people before whenever they faced opposition. Do not be afraid. He says, remember the Lord who is great and awesome. It's one of those first times in the book that you see Nehemiah speak about who the Lord is to the people. There's a renewal of who God is for them. They've already dealt with some renewal in the book of Ezra in preceding generations. This generation needs to hear it too. They're facing a real live opposition, threat of death. Nehemiah gives those words, do not be afraid of them. Remember the Lord who is great and awesome. That will motivate and hopefully give them strength, he says, because now you are also called to fight for your brothers, your sons, your daughters, your wives, and your houses. Notice earlier they prayed but prepared. Here he says, remember the great and awesome God, but be ready to fight, protect. Then they get back to work, verse 15. They return to the work after the opposition fails. It says, now when our enemies heard that it was known to us, in other words, they found out about the plot, and that God had frustrated their plan, then all of us returned to the wall, each one to his work. So with that greater resolve in place, the enemy knows that they're more than aware of what's happening and are ready to fight back. The plan is being frustrated. The workers get back to work. And he says typically, or exactly what was going on in chapter 3, each to his own work. Each had a role, each had their responsibility. We'll see that responsibility is some work on the wall and some protect. Verse 16, you have this continued protection until the wall was completed, where it was this way, half protected, half stood guard. In other words, half of them were doing the protecting and standing guard, half of them were working on the wall. We have this, then it says this, and from that day on, half of my servants carried on the work, while half of them kept hold of the spears, the shields, the bows, and the coats of mail. They had armor on. And it says, and the captains were behind all the house of Judah. They had the support and backing. The house of Judah, the families, that tribe of Judah, those who have returned, the captains were supportive of them. They were ready to go to battle for them, half working on the wall, half standing guard. Well, then you can see that continue on into verses 17 and 18, where it says they were working and guarding at the same time. So it was already highlighted and now it's narrated. Those who were rebuilding the wall, verse 17 says, those who were rebuilding the wall and those who carried burdens carried with one hand during the work and the other keeping hold of a weapon. The picture is rather interesting. You see working and guards guarding, but you also see some people working and guarding. It's like they are ready to battle if they have to put down their tools of rebuilding to fight. It says in verse 18, as for the builders, each wore his sword strapped to his waist as he built, while the trumpeter stood near me. The trumpeter, of course, would be one who would sound the alarm if something were to happen and battle was to start. Notice the picture here, armed for battle, even as they're trying to work, but still some designated for the purpose of guarding. Verse 19 and 20, you have more words from Nehemiah, and now a word about the signal to be given out by the trumpet if need be. Verse 19, he says this. This is Nehemiah. I said to the nobles, the officials, and the rest of the people, the work is great and extensive, and we are separated on the wall far from one another. People are doing their work where they belong. At verse 20, he says this, at whatever place you hear the sound of the trumpet, assemble to us there. So clearly, Nehemiah's going to be walking around, have the trumpet. If something hits, then they will gather. Everyone's got their work. There's a lot of work, he said, and we're separated, but we need to be ready when called upon to fight. And then he concludes with this statement, our God will fight for us. If you remember your Old Testament well, you remember a couple of statements. Go back to Exodus chapter 14, verse 14. There's an echo of Moses' words here. What Moses tells the people coming out of Egypt, getting ready to go in and pass the Red Sea. Verses 13 and 14, in summary, Exodus 14, verses 13 and 14 say this, do not fear, the Lord will fight. This is the same kind of language Nehemiah has used. He says, don't be afraid. He says, remember the great and awesome God. Our God will fight for us. Then later in Deuteronomy 1:30, Moses says the same thing to the next generation. He recalls that the Lord had fought for them back during the Exodus, and he will do so again as they're getting ready to enter into the promised land. Well, here they are returning to the promised land. They've come back, they've rebuilt the temple, but now there's this continuing threat as they're trying to rebuild the wall. Nehemiah invokes the same language of Moses and others in the past. Do not be afraid, our God will fight. As we think about a little bit of application, we're not done with the past. I just want to get this application in now. We need to keep trusting the Lord. If he's called us to do something, then he will have us. He will see that it's done. I know that there's going to be opposition, and maybe there may be battles lost along the way. But what Nehemiah says about God is true about God for us. He will fight for us. If we're doing his will, we may face the opposition, and we will. That's clear. But God will be there with us. Then in verse 21, we see the work further described. Again, kind of a summary of what was said before. Nehemiah says this, so we carried on the work with half of them holding spears from dawn until the stars appeared. What's going on? You have half people working on the walls, half people guarding. You have even those working on the walls having weapons. And then you also have the shifts, people guarding at night and people guarding during the day. With these further instructions in verse 22. Nehemiah says, at that time I also said to the people, each man with his servant shall spend the night within Jerusalem, so that they may be a guard for us by day or by night, and a laborer by day. So now it's almost like we're seeing a different kind of shift change. Work on the wall, guard, flip. And of course, somewhere in there, you've got to get some sleep. But what we see here is a persistent plan, an ongoing activity. Notice then finally in verse 23, the constant protection and caution that is offered. Nehemiah concludes the narrative with these words, so neither I, my brothers, my servants, nor the men of the guard who followed me, none of us removed our clothes. Each took his weapon, even to the water. There was perpetual preparedness. They knew of the opposition. It was real. You might think this is overkill. It's not. They're surrounded by people from different people groups who want to see them gone. And they make those threats. And what Nehemiah has done is prayed for the protection, but also made plans that they would protect themselves, knowing ultimately, just like in the books of Deuteronomy and Joshua, the Lord would fight for them. What can we take from this? Well, again, we note this. Nehemiah and the Jews faced two challenges. The first challenge, of course, was what was necessary to build the wall and the gates. That itself was a challenge. That was formidable enough. The work was hard there. It was a lot. Like we said, they probably had to clean out old stones that weren't worth anything, bring in new stones, and then put all that together with the old stones. But of course, the thing that takes up most space in this lesson and in this chapter is the opposition and criticism from the opponents. When we as we look at studying as we look at working for the Lord, we need to recognize that that is a challenge in and of itself, just doing the Lord's work. But when you try to do it under the threat of death or the threat of any opposition, any criticism, well, that takes it to a whole other level, as they say. It's one thing to do the work of the Lord without opposition. That's enough work. At least it's work that can be done in concert with other people and the Lord. If you throw in the mix opposition, and there's always going to be some opposition, then that makes the work harder. You imagine how hard it is to focus on your job when you're constantly being barraged by threats or opposition and criticism. That's what's going on here. Facing this challenge today, doing kingdom work, we need to recall the list mentioned at the beginning of the lesson that we gave from Randall Everett. Everything you're doing as you work for the Lord, there's going to be opposition. If you're a parent raising a child at home, raising them to try and be the best Christian they can be, you're going to have opposition. If you're working in ministry, you're going to have opposition. If you're going to try and live out the Christian life in a secular world, you're going to face opposition. Anytime you work together as a people to work to bring about kingdom work, you're going to face opposition. There's already that because Satan is opposed to what God is doing. And while he's going down, he's still going to fight. We need to take some principles, then some cues from Nehemiah. Let's adopt Nehemiah's resolve. He is persistent. He is resolved to do the work of God that God has placed on his heart to do. We need to adopt Nehemiah's persistent faith in God. We had the little debate about whether we should pray the way he prayed, but certainly we know what he does. I would challenge you to go back and look at the book of Nehemiah and just count and recall when Nehemiah prayed. He was persistent in his faith in God, not only into praying for God, to God for the people, but in speaking well of God to the people. In other words, he was letting them know God is great. He is awesome. He will fight for you. He acknowledged that God was for them and wanted to encourage others in that regard. And that leads me to the next point. We need to adopt Nehemiah's encouragement of the people. Whatever leadership role you may have, yes, you may deal with your own circumstances and your own challenge with the opposition, but at the end, as leader, you need to lead out in how to oppose. And part of that is giving encouragement and strength, helping to motivate and let people know that they are in God's hands, that what they're doing is good and right and will be meaningful and will have a lasting impact. Notice then what Nehemiah does in speaking to the people to offer encouragement, speaking truth to them about the nature of God's power, but then also motivating them in a way that they are able to do the work that they need to do. We need to also adopt Nehemiah's approach in seeking sound instruction and planning. You know, I forget which missionary said it. You'll remember it. I forget who said it. Someone will post in the comments who said it. Pray as if it all depends on God, work as if it all depends on you. Um, Maybe there are certain things we can take issue with that in regard, but see what Nehemiah does. He prays, God, you need to do this. He prays that that something needs to be done with the opposition. He turns it over to God, but then he plans over and over again for the people to do the work. Yes, God's covering is over them. They still have to do the work. There's sound instruction and planning. We need to adopt Nehemiah's focus on the task and that those he was leading and not on the people. We need to reference the critics at some point, maybe if they're willing to listen, but if there's that kind of opposition, they're not listening. Nehemiah then said, let's do what we need to do to focus on the task. We're ready for them if they come. But all of this preparation for battle is so that the work can get done. The focus is still on job number one, and that is building the wall. So he was focused on the task, and he was focused on those that he was leading. In this text, he's not referenced as talking to the critics at all. He's just doing the work of leading his people. He's allowing God to take over, and he's even prayed for God to take over. As, excuse me. And then, of course, we have Nehemiah's plan of protection. We need to be on the lookout for our people. I don't know what that's going to look like from place to place. I know that in some places it's more dangerous to be a Christian than in America. I think we think it's pretty dangerous here. It's compared to the world, it's nothing. But we need to be prepared. We need to have a plan in place. There's a lot that Nehemiah can teach us in the way he acted, and maybe a couple things we can question, but certainly what we're seeing here is his trust in God and his planning and strategy to get the work done. having a plan in place to do the work of God, always being ready for the opposition. But the opposition, or excuse me, but the preparedness for the opposition is so that the work can be done. Notice again his focus. There's a lot more that we can say. I'm sure you have some other thoughts on this. What are some of the thoughts you have? I'd love to hear you comment. I know we don't have a lot of interaction in the comments, and we don't have really a lot of interaction face to face because this is a recording, but I would love to hear any kind of thoughts you have. And so you could respond in the comments below, whether you're watching on Facebook or on YouTube, and think about the shared opposition that we have. In other words, all of us trying to seek the Lord's work and do his work or finding opposition. What are some suggestions you would have? What are some other principles you see in these passages that we need to adopt and trust God for? Let's have a word of prayer and we'll prepare for the next lesson. Father, we thank you for this word. We know that there's a lot that's going on here. We know that whenever someone is going to do your work, there's going to be opposition. Help us to turn ourselves over to you, but also help us to make the right decisions regarding how we deal with the opposition. We thank you for Jesus' example, knowing that he entrusted everything to you and that you saw him through. There are many more things that we can learn. I pray you help us to continue to grow in our study of the book of Nehemiah, to know you better, to serve you, to honor you and bless you, to represent you well. We thank you for Jesus and your Holy Spirit guiding us, that your Spirit would give us discernment and help us to make wise choices when dealing with the work you've called us to do and the opposition we may face along the way. We trust you and we call on you for your help and your guidance. We love you and thank you and praise you and worship you in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, our next lesson is going to be entitled, and I'll pull up that in a moment. It's going to be entitled Confronting Injustice. Let's go ahead and take a look at that. We're going to be looking at the few verses out of Nehemiah chapter 5. We're going to look at verses 6 to 13 as our focus. Clearly, the entirety of the chapter is going to be significant, and so we'll do something similar, maybe not to the same depth as we did for today, but looking at this chapter in its context. Here, there's an internal issue that's taking place, and Nehemiah is going to address that. So we've dealt with external problems. We're going to deal with an internal one as well. Until our next lesson, I pray that the Lord will bless you and keep you, make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you, and that the Lord will lift up his face to you and give you peace. I'll see you in the next lesson.